Forthwith the geographer set off, hoisting himself up very cleverly from bough to bough, till he disappeared beyond the thick foliage. His companions began to arrange the night quarters and prepare their beds. But this was neither a long nor difficult task, and very soon they resumed their seats round the fire to have a talk. As usual, their theme was Captain Grant. In 3 days, should the water subside, they would be on board the Duncan once more. But Harry Grant and his 2 sailors, those poor shipwrecked fellows, would not be with them. Indeed, it even seemed after this ill success and this useless journey across America that all chance of finding them was gone forever. Where could they commence a fresh quest? What grief Lady Helena and Mary Grant would feel on hearing there was no further hope. "Poor sister," said Robert, "it is all up with us." For the first time, Glenarvan could not find any comfort to give him. What could he say to the lad? Had they not searched exactly where the document stated? And yet, he said, this 37th degree of latitude is not a mere figure, and that it applies to the shipwreck or captivity of Harry Grant is no mere guess or supposition. We read it with our own eyes. "All very true, Your Honor," replied Tom Austin, "and yet our search has been unsuccessful." "It is both a provoking and hopeless business," replied Glenarvan. "Provoking enough, certainly," said the Major, "but not hopeless. It is precisely because we have an uncontestable figure provided for us that we should follow it up to the end." "What do you mean?" asked Glenarvan. "What more can we do?" "A very logical and simple thing, my dear Edward. When we go on board the Duncan, turn her beak head to the east, and go right along the 37th parallel till we come back to our starting point if necessary." "Do you suppose that I have not thought of that, Mr. McNabbs?" replied Glenarvan. "Yes, 100 times. But what chance is there of success? To leave the American continent, wouldn't it be to go away from the very spot indicated by Harry Grant, from this very Patagonia so distinctly named in the document? And would you recommence your search in the Pampas, when you have the certainty that the shipwreck of the Britannia neither occurred on the coasts of the Pacific nor the Atlantic?" Glenarvan was silent. "And however small the chance of finding Harry Grant by following up the given parallel, ought we not to try?" "I don't say no," replied Glenarvan. "And are you not of my opinion, good friends?" added the Major, addressing the sailors. "Entirely," said Tom Austin, while Mulrady and Wilson gave an assenting nod. "Listen to me, friends," said Glenarvan after a few minutes' reflection, "and remember, Robert, this is a grave discussion. I will do my utmost to find Captain Grant. I am pledged to it, and will devote my whole life to the task if needs be. All Scotland would unite with me to save so devoted a son as he has been to her. I too quite think with you that we must follow the 37th parallel round the globe if necessary, however slight our chance of finding him. But that is not the question we have to settle. There is one much more important than that is, should we from this time, and altogether, give up our search on the American continent?" No one made any reply. Each one seemed afraid to pronounce the word. "Well," resumed Glenarvan, addressing himself especially to the Major. "My dear Edward," replied McNabbs, "it would be incurring too great a responsibility for me to reply hic et nunc. It is a question which requires reflection. I must know first, through which countries the 37th parallel of southern latitude passes." "That's Paganel's business, he will tell you that," said Glenarvan. "Let us ask him then," replied the Major. But the learned geographer was nowhere to be seen. He was hidden among the thick leafage of the ombu, and they must call out if they wanted him. "Paganel, Paganel," shouted Glenarvan. "Here," replied a voice that seemed to come from the clouds. "Where are you?" "In my tower." "What are you doing there?" "Examining the wide horizon." "Could you come down for a minute?" "Do you want me?" "Yes." "What for?" "To know what countries the 37th parallel passes through." "That's easily said. I need not disturb myself to come down for that." "Very well, tell us now." "Listen, then. After leaving America, the 37th parallel crosses the Atlantic Ocean." "And then?" "It encounters Isle Tristan da Cunha." "Yes." "It goes on 2 degrees below the Cape of Good Hope." "And afterwards?" "Runs across the Indian Ocean, and just touches Isle St. Pierre in the Amsterdam group. Go on. It cuts Australia by the province of Victoria. And then, after leaving Australia in, this last sentence was not completed. Was the geographer hesitating, or didn't he know what to say? No, but a terrible cry resounded from the top of the tree. Glenarvan and his friends turned pale and looked at each other. What fresh catastrophe had happened now? Had the unfortunate Paganel slipped his footing? Already Wilson and Mulready had rushed to his rescue when his long body appeared tumbling down from branch to branch. But was he living or dead? For his hands made no attempt to seize anything to stop himself. A few minutes more, and he would have fallen into the roaring waters had not the Major's strong arm barred his passage. "Much obliged, McNabbs," said Paganel. "How's this? What is the matter with you? What came over you? Another of your absent fits." "Yes, yes," replied Paganel, in a voice almost inarticulate with emotion. "Yes, but this was something extraordinary." "What was it?" "I said we had made a mistake. We are making it still and have been all along." "Explain yourself." "Glenarvan, Major, Robert, my friends," exclaimed Paganel, "all you that hear me, we are looking for Captain Grant where he is not to be found." "What do you say?" exclaimed Glenarvan. "Not only where he is not now, but where he has never been." Chapter 24, Paganel's Disclosure. Profound astonishment greeted these unexpected words of the learned geographer. What could he mean? Had he lost his sense? He spoke with such conviction, however, that all eyes turned toward Glenarvan, for Paganel's affirmation was a direct answer to his question, but Glenarvan shook his head and said nothing, though evidently he was not inclined to favor his friend's views. "Yes," began Paganel again, as soon as he had recovered himself a little. "Yes, we have gone a wrong track and read on the document what was never there." "Explain yourself, Paganel," said the Major, "and more calmly if you can." "The thing is very simple, Major. Like you, I was in error. Like you, I had rushed at a false interpretation, until about an instant ago on the top of the tree, when I was answering your questions, just as I pronounced the word Australia. A sudden flash came across my mind, and the document became clear as day." "What?" exclaimed Glenarvan. "You mean to say that Harry Grant—" "I mean to say," replied Paganel, "that the word austral that occurs in the document is not a complete word, as we have supposed up till now, but just the root of the word australly." "Well, that would be strange," said the Major. "Strange," repeated Glenarvan, shrugging his shoulders. "It is simply impossible." "Impossible," returned Paganel. "That is a word we don't allow in France." "What?" continued Glenarvan, in a tone of the most profound incredulity. "You dare to contend, with the document in your hand, that the shipwreck of the Britannia happened on the shores of Australia?" "I am sure of it," replied Paganel. "My conscience," exclaimed Glenarvan. "I must say I am surprised at such a declaration from the Secretary of a Geographical Society." "And why so?" said Paganel, touched in his weak point. "Because, if you allow the word Australia, you must also allow the word Indians, and Indians are never seen there." Paganel was not the least surprised at this rejoinder. Doubtless he expected it, for he began to smile and said, "My dear Glenarvan, don't triumph over me too fast. I am going to floor you completely, and never was an Englishman more thoroughly defeated than you will be. It will be the revenge for Cressy and Agincourt." "I wish nothing better. Take your revenge, Paganel." "Listen, then. In the text of the document, there is neither mention of the Indians nor of Patagonia. The incomplete word Indi does not mean Indians, but of course, indigenes, aborigines. Now, do you admit that there are aborigines in Australia?" "Bravo, Paganel," said the Major. "Well, do you agree to my interpretation, my dear lord?" asked the geographer again. "Yes," replied Glenarvan, "if you will prove to me that the fragment of a word Goni does not refer to the country of the Patagonians." "Certainly it does not. It has nothing to do with Patagonia," said Paganel. "Read it any way you please except that." "How?" "Cosmogony, theogony, agony." "Agony," said the Major. "I don't care which," returned Paganel. "The word is quite unimportant. I will not even try to find out its meaning. The main point is that austral means australly, and we must have gone blindly on a wrong track not to have discovered the explanation at the very beginning. It was so evident. If I had found the document myself, and my judgment had not been misled by your interpretation, I should never have read it differently." A burst of hurrahs and congratulations and compliments followed Paganel's words. Austin and the sailors, and the Major and Robert, most all overjoyed at this fresh hope, applauded him heartily, while even Glenarvan, whose eyes were gradually getting open, was almost prepared to give in. "I only want to know one thing more, my dear Paganel," he said, "and then I must bow to your perspicacity." "What is it?" "How will you group the words together according to your new interpretation? How will the document read?" "Easily enough answered. Here is the document," replied Paganel, taking out the precious paper he had been studying so conscientiously for the last few days. For a few minutes there was complete silence, while the worthy savant took time to collect his thoughts before complying with his lordship's request. Then, putting his finger on the words, and emphasizing some of them, he began as follows. Le 7 juin 1862 Le Trois Mats Bretagne de Glasgow à Sombre après. Put, if you please, 2 jours, 3 jours, or une longue agonie. It doesn't signify, it is quite a matter of indifference. Sur les côtes de l'Australie. Si dirigentaire du matelots et le capitaine Grant vont esser de border, or ont aboard le continent aux îles Seront, or sont prisonniers de cruels indigènes. Ils ont gitsi documents, etc. Is that clear? "Clear enough," replied Glenarvan, "if the word continent can be applied to Australia, which is only an island." "Make yourself easy about that, my dear Glenarvan. The best geographers have agreed to call the island the Australian continent." "Then all I have now to say is, my friends," said Glenarvan, "away to Australia, and may Heaven help us." "To Australia," echoed his companions with one voice. "I tell you what, Paganel," added Glenarvan, "your being on board the Duncan is a perfect providence." "All right, look on me as a messenger of Providence, and let us drop the subject." So the conversation ended, a conversation which great results were to follow. It completely changed the moral condition of the travelers. It gave the clue of the labyrinth in which they had thought themselves hopelessly entangled, and, amid their ruined projects, inspired them with fresh hope. They could now quit the American continent without the least hesitation, and already their thoughts had flown to the Australias. In going on board the Duncan again, they would not bring despair with them, and Lady Helena and Mary Grant would not have to mourn the irrevocable loss of Captain Grant. This thought so filled them with joy that they forgot all the dangers of their actual situation, and only regretted that they could not start immediately. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they determined to have supper at 6. Paganel wished to get up a splendid spread in honor of the occasion, but as the materials were very scanty, he proposed to Robert to go and hunt in the neighboring forest. Robert clapped his hands at the idea, so they took Thalcave's powder flask, cleaned the revolvers, and loaded them with small shot, and set off. "Don't go too far," said the Major gravely to the two hunters. After their departure, Glenarvan and McNabbs went down to examine the state of the water by looking at the notches they had made on the tree, and Wilson and Mulready replenished the fire. No sign of decrease appeared on the surface of the immense lake, yet the flood seemed to have reached its maximum height. But the violence with which it rushed from the south to north proved that the equilibrium of the Argentine rivers was not restored. Before getting lower, the liquid mass must remain stationary, as in the case with the ocean before the ebb tide commences. While Glenarvan and his cousin were making these observations, the report of firearms resounded frequently above their heads, and the jubilant outcries of the two sportsmen, for Paganel was every whit as much a child as Robert. They were having a fine time of it among the thick leaves, judging by the peals of laughter which rang out in the boy's clear treble voice and Paganel's deep bass. The chase was evidently successful, and wonders in culinary art might be expected. Wilson had a good idea to begin with, which he had skillfully carried out. For when Glenarvan came back to the brazier, he found that the brave fellow had actually managed to catch, with only a pin and a piece of string, several dozen small fish, as delicate as smelts, called moharas, which were all jumping about in a fold of his poncho, ready to be converted into an exquisite dish. At the same moment the hunters reappeared. Paganel was carefully carrying some black swallows, eggs, and a string of sparrows, which he meant to serve up later under the name of field larks. Robert had been clever enough to bring down several brace of jilgueros, small green and yellow birds, which are excellent eating, and greatly in demand in the Montevideo market. Paganel, who knew 50 ways of dressing eggs, was obliged for this once to be content with simply hardening them on the hot embers. But notwithstanding this, the viands at the meal were both dainty and varied. The dried beef, hard eggs, grilled mojaras, sparrows, and roast hilgueros made one of those gala feasts the memory of which is imperishable. The conversation was very animated. Many compliments were paid Paganel on his twofold talents as hunter and cook, which the savant accepted with the modesty which characterizes true merit. Then he turned the conversation on the peculiarities of the Ombu, under whose canopy they had found shelter, and whose depths he declared were immense. Robert and I, he added jestingly, thought ourselves hunting in the open forest. I was afraid for the minute we should lose ourselves, for I could not find the road. The sun was sinking below the horizon. I sought vainly for footmarks. I began to feel the sharp pangs of hunger, and the gloomy depths of the forest resounded already with the roar of wild beasts. No, not that. There are no wild beasts here, I am sorry to say. What? Exclaimed Glenarvan. You are sorry there are no wild beasts? Certainly I am. And yet we should have every reason to dread their ferocity. Their ferocity is non-existent, scientifically speaking, replied the learned geographer. Now come, Paganel, said the Major, you'll never make me admit the utility of wild beasts. What good are they? Why, Major, exclaimed Paganel, for purposes of classification into orders and families and species and subspecies. A mighty advantage, certainly, replied McNabbs. I could dispense with all that. If I had been one of Noah's companions at the time of the deluge, I should most assuredly have hindered the imprudent patriarch from putting in pairs of lions and tigers and panthers and bears and such animals, for they are as malevolent as they are useless. You would have done that? Asked Paganel. Yes, I would. Well, you would have done wrong in a zoological point of view, returned Paganel. But not in a humanitarian one, rejoined the Major. It is shocking, replied Paganel. Why, for my part, on the contrary, I should have taken special care to preserve megatheriums and pterodactyls, and all the antediluvian species of which we are unfortunately deprived by his neglect. And I say, returned McNabbs, that Noah did a very good thing when he abandoned them to their fate, that is, if they lived in his day. And I say he did a very bad thing, retorted Paganel, and he has justly merited the malediction of savants to the end of time. The rest of the party could not help laughing at hearing the two friends disputing over old Noah. Contrary to all his principles, the Major, who all his life had never disputed with anyone, was always sparring with Paganel. The geographer seemed to have a peculiarly exciting effect on him. Glenarvan, as usual, always the peacemaker, interfered in the debate and said, whether the loss of ferocious animals is to be regretted or not, in a scientific point of view, there is no help for it now. We must be content to do without them. Paganel can hardly expect to meet with wild beasts in this aerial forest. Why not? Asked the geographer. Wild beasts on a tree, exclaimed Tom Austin. Yes, undoubtedly. The American tiger, the jaguar, takes refuge in the trees when the chase gets too hot for him. It is quite possible that one of these animals, surprised by the inundation, might have climbed up into this ombu and be hiding now among its thick foliage. You haven't met any of them, at any rate, I suppose, said the Major. No, replied Paganel, though we hunted all through the wood. It is vexing, for it would have been a splendid chase. A jaguar is a bloodthirsty, ferocious creature. He can twist the neck of a horse with a single stroke of his paw. When he has once tasted human flesh, he scents it greedily. He likes to eat an Indian best, and next to him a Negro, then a mulatto, and last of all a white man. I am delighted to hear we come number 4, said McNabbs. That only proves you are insipid, retorted Paganel with an air of disdain. I am delighted to be insipid, was the Major's reply. Well, it is humiliating enough, said the intractable Paganel. The white man proclaimed himself chief of the human race, but Mr. Jaguar is of a different opinion, it seems. Be that as it may, my brave Paganel, seeing there are neither Indians, nor Negroes, nor mulattoes among us, I am quite rejoiced at the absence of your beloved jaguars. Our situation is not so particularly agreeable. What, not agreeable? Exclaimed Paganel, jumping at the word as likely to give a new turn to the conversation. You are complaining of your lot, Glenarvan. I should think so, indeed, replied Glenarvan. Do you find these uncomfortable hard branches very luxurious? I have never been more comfortable, even in my study. We live like the birds, we sing and fly about. I begin to believe men were intended to live on trees. But they want wings, suggested the major. They'll make them someday. Until then, put in Glenarvan, with your leave, I prefer the gravel of a park, or the floor of a house, or the deck of a ship to this aerial dwelling. We must take things as they come, Glenarvan, returned Paganel. If good, so much the better, if bad, never mind. Ah, I see you are wishing you had all the comforts of Malcolm Castle. No, but I am quite certain Robert is perfectly happy, interrupted Paganel, eager to ensure one partisan at least. Yes, that I am, exclaimed Robert in a joyous tone. At his age it is quite natural, replied Glenarvan. And at mine, too, returned the geographer. The fewer one's comforts, the fewer one's needs, and the fewer one's needs, the greater one's happiness. Now, said the major, here is Paganel running a tilt against riches and gilt ceilings. No, McNabbs, replied the savant, I'm not. But if you like, I'll tell you a little Arabian story that comes into my mind, very apropos this minute. Oh, do, said Robert. And what is your story to prove, Paganel? Inquired the major. Much what all stories prove, my brave comrade. Not much then, rejoined McNabbs, but go on, Scheherazade, and tell us the story. There was once, said Paganel, a son of the great Haroun al-Raschid who was unhappy, and went to consult an old dervish. The old sage told him that happiness was a difficult thing to find in this world. However, he added, I know an infallible means of procuring your happiness. What is it? Asked the young prince. It is to put the shirt of a happy man on your shoulders. Whereupon the prince embraced the old man, and set out at once to search for his talisman. He visited all the capital cities in the world. He tried on the shirts of kings, and emperors, and princes, and nobles, but all in vain. He could not find a man among them that was happy. Then he put on the shirts of artists, and warriors, and merchants, but these were no better. By this time he had traveled a long way, without finding what he sought. At last he began to despair of success, and began sorrowfully to retrace his steps back to his father's palace, when one day he heard an honest peasant singing so merrily as he drove the plough, that he thought, surely this man is happy, if there is such a thing as happiness on earth. Forthwith he accosted him and said, Are you happy? Yes, was the reply. There is nothing you desire? Nothing. You would not change your lot for that of a king? Never. Well then, sell me your shirt. My shirt, I haven't one. Chapter 25, Between Fire and Water. Before turning into their nest, as Paganel had called it, he and Robert and Glenarvan climbed up into the observatory to have one more inspection of the liquid plain. It was about 9 o'clock. The sun had just sunk behind the glowing mists of the western horizon. The eastern horizon was gradually assuming a most stormy aspect. A thick dark bar of cloud was rising higher and higher, and by degrees extinguishing the stars. Before long half the sky was overspread. Evidently motive power lay in the cloud itself, for there was not a breath of wind. Absolute calm reigned in the atmosphere. Not a leaf stirred on the tree, not a ripple disturbed the surface of the water. There seemed to be scarcely any air even, as though some vast pneumatic machine had rarefied it. The entire atmosphere was charged to the utmost with electricity, the presence of which sent a thrill through the whole nervous system of all animated beings. We are going to have a storm, said Paganel. You're not afraid of thunder, are you, Robert? Asked Glenarvan. No, my lord, exclaimed Robert. Well, my boy, so much the better, for a storm is not far off. And a violent one, too, added Paganel, if I may judge by the look of things. It is not the storm I care about, said Glenarvan, so much as the torrents of rain that will accompany it. We shall be soaked to the skin. Whatever you may say, Paganel, a nest won't do for a man, and you will learn that soon to your cost. With the help of philosophy, it will, replied Paganel. Philosophy, that won't keep you from getting drenched. No, but it will warm you. Well, said Glenarvan, we had better go down to our friends and advise them to wrap themselves up in their philosophy and their ponchos as tightly as possible, and above all, to lay in a stock of patience, for we shall need it before very long. Glenarvan gave a last glance at the angry sky. The clouds now covered it entirely. Only a dim streak of light shone faintly in the west. A dark shadow lay on the water, and it could hardly be distinguished from the thick vapors above it. There was no sensation of light or sound. All was darkness and silence around. "Let us go down," said Glenarvan. "The thunder will soon burst over us." On returning to the bottom of the tree, they found themselves, to their great surprise, in a sort of dim twilight, produced by myriads of luminous specks which appeared buzzing confusedly over the surface of the water. "It is phosphorescence, I suppose," said Glenarvan. "No, but phosphorescent insects, positive glowworms, living diamonds, which the ladies of Buenos Aires convert into magnificent ornaments." "What?" exclaimed Robert, "those sparks flying about are insects?" "Yes, my boy." Robert caught one in his hand and found Paganel was right. It was a kind of large drone, an inch long, and the Indians call it tuco tuco. This curious specimen of the coleoptera sheds its radiance from two spots in the front of its breastplate, and the light is sufficient to read by. Holding his watch close to the insect, Paganel saw distinctly that the time was 10 p.m. On rejoining the Major and his three sailors, Glenarvan warned them of the approaching storm, and advised them to secure themselves in their beds of branches as firmly as possible, for there was no doubt that after the first clap of thunder the wind would become unchained, and the ombu would be violently shaken. Though they could not defend themselves from the waters above, they might at least keep out of the rushing current beneath. They wished one another good night, though hardly daring to hope for it, and then each one rolled himself in his poncho and lay down to sleep. But the approach of the great phenomena of nature excites vague uneasiness in the heart of every sentient being, even in the most strong-minded. The whole party in the ombu felt agitated and oppressed, and not one of them could close his eyes. The first peal of thunder found them wide awake. It occurred about 11 p.m. and sounded like a distant rolling. Glenarvan ventured to creep out of the sheltering foliage and made his way to the extremity of the horizontal branch to take a look round. The deep blackness of the night was already scarified with sharp bright lines, which were reflected back by the water with unerring exactness. The clouds had rent in many parts, but noiselessly, like some soft cotton material. After attentively observing both the zenith and horizon, Glenarvan went back to the center of the trunk. "Well, Glenarvan, what's your report?" asked Paganel. "I say it is beginning in good earnest, and if it goes on so, we shall have a terrible storm." "So much the better," replied the enthusiastic Paganel. "I should like a grand exhibition, since we can't run away." "That's another of your theories," said the Major. "And one of my best, McNabbs. I am of Glenarvan's opinion that the storm will be superb. Just a minute ago, when I was trying to sleep, several facts occurred to my memory that make me hope it will, for we are in the region of great electrical tempests. For instance, I have read somewhere that in 1793, in this very province of Buenos Aires, lightning struck 37 times during one single storm. My colleague, M. Martin de Maussy, counted 55 minutes of uninterrupted rolling." "Watch in hand?" asked the Major. "Watch in hand. Only one thing makes me uneasy," added Paganel, "if it is any use to be uneasy, and that is, that the culminating point of this plain is just this very ombu where we are. A lightning conductor would be very serviceable to us at present, for it is this tree especially, among all that grow in the pampas, that the thunder has a particular affection for. Besides, I need not tell you, friend, that learned men tell us never to take refuge under trees during a storm." "Most seasonable advice, certainly, in our circumstances," said the Major. "I must confess, Paganel," replied Glenarvan, "that you might have chosen a better time for this reassuring information." "Bah," replied Paganel, "all times are good for getting information. Ha, now it's beginning." Louder peals of thunder interrupted this inopportune conversation, the violence increasing with the noise, till the whole atmosphere seemed to vibrate with rapid oscillations. The incessant flashes of lightning took various forms. Some darted down perpendicularly from the sky 5 or 6 times in the same place in succession. Others would have excited the interest of a savant to the highest degree, for though Arago, in his curious statistics, only cites 2 examples of forked lightning, it was visible here hundreds of times. Some of the flashes branched out in 1,000 different directions, making coralliform zigzags, and threw out wonderful jets of arborescent light. Soon the whole sky from east to north seemed supported by a phosphoric band of intense brilliancy. This kept increasing by degrees till it overspread the entire horizon, kindling the clouds which were faithfully mirrored in the waters as if they were masses of combustible material, beneath, and presented the appearance of an immense globe of fire, the center of which was the ombu. Glenarvan and his companions gazed silently at this terrifying spectacle. They could not make their voices heard, but the sheets of white light which enwrapped them every now and then revealed the face of one and another, sometimes the calm features of the Major, sometimes the eager, curious glance of Paganel, or the energetic face of Glenarvan, and at others the scared eyes of the terrified Robert and the careless looks of the sailors, investing them with a weird, spectral aspect. However, as yet, no rain had fallen, and the wind had not risen in the least. But this state of things was of short duration. Before long, the cataracts of the sky burst forth and came down in vertical streams. As the large drops fell splashing into the lake, fiery sparks seemed to fly out from the illuminated surface. Was the rain the finale of the storm? If so, Glenarvan and his companions would escape scot-free, except for a few vigorous douche baths. No. At the very height of this struggle of the electric forces of the atmosphere, a large ball of fire appeared suddenly at the extremity of the horizontal parent branch, as thick as a man's wrist, and surrounded with black smoke. This ball, after turning round and round for a few seconds, burst like a bombshell, and with so much noise that the explosion was distinctly audible above the general fracas. A sulphurous smoke filled the air, and complete silence reigned till the voice of Tom Austin was heard shouting, "The tree is on fire." Tom was right. In a moment, as if some fireworks were being ignited, the flame ran along the west side of the ombu. The dead wood and nests of dried grass, and the whole sap, which was of a spongy texture, supplied food for its devouring activity. The wind had risen now and fanned the flame. It was time to flee, and Glenarvan and his party hurried away to the eastern side of their refuge, which was meantime untouched by the fire. They were all silent, troubled, and terrified, as they watched branch after branch shrivel and crack and writhe in the flame like living serpents, and then drop into the swollen torrent, still red and gleaming, as it was borne swiftly along on the rapid current. The flame sometimes rose to a prodigious height, and seemed almost lost in the atmosphere, and sometimes, beaten down by the hurricane, closely enveloped the ombu like a robe of Nessus. Terror seized the entire group. They were almost suffocated with smoke, and scorched with the unbearable heat, for the conflagration had already reached the lower branches on their side of the ombu. To extinguish it or check its progress was impossible, and they saw themselves irrevocably condemned to a torturing death, like the victims of Hindu divinities. At last, their situation was absolutely intolerable. Of the two deaths staring them in the face, they had better choose the less cruel. "To the water!" exclaimed Glenarvan. Wilson, who was nearest the flames, had already plunged into the lake, but next minute he screamed out in the most violent terror, "Help, help!" Austin rushed toward him, and with the assistance of the Major, dragged him up again on the tree. "What's the matter?" they asked. "Alligators, alligators," replied Wilson. The whole foot of the tree appeared to be surrounded by these formidable animals of the saurian order. By the glare of the flames, they were immediately recognized by Paganel as the ferocious species peculiar to America, called caimans in the Spanish territories. About 10 of them were there, lashing the water with their powerful tails and attacking the ombu with the long teeth of their lower jaw. At this sight, the unfortunate men gave themselves up to be lost. A frightful death was in store for them, since they must either be devoured by the fire or by the caimans. Even the Major said, in a calm voice, "This is the beginning of the end now." There are circumstances in which men are powerless, when the unchained elements can only be combated by other elements. Glenarvan gazed with haggard looks at the fire and water leagued against him, hardly knowing what deliverance to implore from heaven. The violence of the storm had abated, but it had developed in the atmosphere a considerable quantity of vapors, to which electricity was about to communicate immense force. An enormous waterspout was gradually forming in the south, a cone of thick mists, but with the point at the bottom and base at the top, linking together the turbulent water and the angry clouds. This meteor soon began to move forward, turning over and over on itself with dizzy rapidity, and sweeping up into its center a column of water from the lake, while its gyratory motions made all the surrounding currents of air rush toward it. A few seconds more, and the gigantic waterspout threw itself on the ombu, and caught it up in its whirl. The tree shook to its roots. Glenarvan could fancy the caiman's teeth were tearing it up from the soil, for as he and his companions held on, each clinging firmly to the other, they felt the towering ombu give way, and the next minute it fell right over with a terrible hissing noise, as the flaming branches touched the foaming water. It was the work of an instant. Already the waterspout had passed to carry on its destructive work elsewhere. It seemed to empty the lake in its passage by continually drawing up the water into itself. The Ambu now began to drift rapidly along, impelled by wind and current. All the caimans had taken their departure, except one that was crawling over the upturned roots and coming toward the poor refugees with wide open jaws. But Mulready, seizing hold of a branch that was half burned off, struck the monster such a tremendous blow that it fell back into the torrent and disappeared, lashing the water with its formidable tail. Glenarvan and his companions, being thus delivered from the voracious saurians, stationed themselves on the branches windward of the conflagration, while the Ambu sailed along like a blazing fireship through the dark night, the flames spreading themselves round like sails before the breath of the hurricane. Chapter 26: The Return on Board. For 2 hours the Ambu navigated the immense lake without reaching terra firma. The flames which were devouring it had gradually died out. The chief danger of their frightful passage was thus removed, and the major went the length of saying that he should not be surprised if they were saved after all. The direction of the current remained unchanged, always running from southwest to northeast. Profound darkness had again set in, only illumined here and there by a parting flash of lightning. The storm was nearly over. The rain had given place to light mists, which a breath of wind dispersed, and the heavy masses of cloud had separated, and now streaked the sky in long bands. The Ambu was borne onward so rapidly by the impetuous torrent that anyone might have supposed some powerful locomotive engine was hidden in its trunk. It seemed likely enough they might continue drifting in this way for days. About 3 o'clock in the morning, however, the major noticed that the roots were beginning to graze the ground occasionally, and by sounding the depth of the water with a long branch, Tom Austin found that they were getting on rising ground. 20 minutes afterward, the Ambu stopped short with a violent jolt. "Land, land!" shouted Paganel in a ringing tone. The extremity of the calcined bow had struck some hillock, and never were sailors more glad. The rock to them was the port. Already Robert and Wilson had leaped onto the solid plateau with a loud, joyful hurrah, when a well-known whistle was heard. The gallop of a horse resounded over the plain, and the tall form of Thalcave emerged from the darkness. "Thalcave, Thalcave!" they all cried with one voice. "Amigos," replied the Patagonian, who had been waiting for the travelers here in the same place where the current had landed himself. As he spoke, he lifted up Robert in his arms and hugged him to his breast, never imagining that Paganel was hanging on to him. A general and hearty handshaking followed, and everyone rejoiced at seeing their faithful guide again. Then the Patagonian led the way into the hangar of a deserted estancia, where there was a good, blazing fire to warm them, and a substantial meal of fine, juicy slices of venison soon broiling, of which they did not leave a crumb. When their minds had calmed down a little, and they were able to reflect on the dangers they had come through from flood and fire and alligators, they could scarcely believe they had escaped. Thalcave, in a few words, gave Paganel an account of himself since they parted, entirely ascribing his deliverance to his intrepid horse. Then Paganel tried to make him understand their new interpretation of the document and the consequent hopes they were indulging. Whether the Indian actually understood his ingenious hypothesis was a question, but he saw that they were glad and confident, and that was enough for him. As can easily be imagined, after their compulsory rest on the Ambu, the travelers were up betimes and ready to start. At 8 o'clock they set off. No means of transport being procurable so far south, they were compelled to walk. However, it was not more than 40 miles now that they had to go, and Thayuka would not refuse to give a lift occasionally to a tired pedestrian, or even to a couple at a pinch. In 36 hours they might reach the shores of the Atlantic. The low-lying tract of marshy ground, still under water, soon lay behind them, as Thalcave led them upward to the higher plains. Here the Argentine territory resumed its monotonous aspect. A few clumps of trees, planted by European hands, might chance to be visible among the pasturage, but quite as rarely as in Tandil and Tapalquem Sierras. The native trees are only found on the edge of long prairies and about Cape Corrients. Next day, though still 15 miles distant, the proximity of the ocean was sensibly felt. The Vurazin, a peculiar wind which blows regularly half of the day and night, bent down the heads of the tall grasses. Thinly planted woods rose to view, and small tree-like mimosas, bushes of acacia, and tufts of coromandel. Here and there, shining like pieces of broken glass, were salinous lagoons, which increased the difficulty of the journey as the travelers had to wind round them to get past. They pushed on as quickly as possible, hoping to reach Lake Salado on the shores of the ocean the same day. And at 8 p.m., when they found themselves in front of the sandhills 200 feet high, which skirt the coast, they were all tolerably tired. But when the long murmur of the distant ocean fell on their ears, the exhausted men forgot their fatigue and ran up the sandhills with surprising agility. But it was getting quite dark already, and their eager gaze could discover no traces of the Duncan on the gloomy expanse of water that met their sight. "But she is there for all that," exclaimed Glenarvan, "waiting for us and running alongside." "We shall see her tomorrow," replied McNabbs. Tom Austin hailed the invisible yacht, but there was no response. The wind was very high and the sea rough. The clouds were scudding along from the west, and the spray of the waves dashed up even to the sandhills. It was little wonder, then, if the man on the lookout could neither hear nor make himself heard, supposing the Duncan were there. There was no shelter on the coast for her, neither bay nor cove, nor port, not so much as a creek. The shore was composed of sandbanks which ran out into the sea and were more dangerous to approach than rocky shoals. The sandbanks irritate the waves and make the sea so particularly rough that in heavy weather vessels that run aground there are invariably dashed to pieces. Though, then, the Duncan would keep far away from such a coast, John Mangles is a prudent captain to get near. Tom Austin, however, was of the opinion that she would be able to keep 5 miles out. The major advised his impatient relative to restrain himself to circumstances. Since there was no means of dissipating the darkness, what was the use of straining his eyes by vainly endeavoring to pierce through it? He set to work immediately to prepare the night's encampment beneath the shelter of the sandhills. The last provisions supplied the last meal, and afterward, each, following the major's example, scooped out a hole in the sand, which made a comfortable enough bed, and then covered himself with the soft material up to his chin and fell into a heavy sleep. But Glenarvan kept watch. There was still a stiff breeze of wind, and the ocean had not recovered its equilibrium after the recent storm. The waves, at all times tumultuous, now broke over the sandbanks with a noise like thunder. Glenarvan could not rest, knowing the Duncan was so near him. As to supposing she had not arrived at the appointed rendezvous, that was out of the question. Glenarvan had left the bay of Talcahuano on the 14th of October, and arrived on the shores of the Atlantic on the 12th of November. He had taken 30 days to cross Chile, the Cordilleras, the Pampas, and the Argentine Plains, giving the Duncan ample time to double Cape Horn and arrive on the opposite side. For such a fast runner there were no impediments. Certainly the storm had been very violent, and its fury must have been terrible on such a vast battlefield as the Atlantic, but the yacht was a good ship, and the captain was a good sailor. He was bound to be there, and he would be there. These reflections, however, did not calm Glenarvan. When the heart and the reason are struggling, it is generally the heart that wins the mastery. The Laird of Malcolm Castle felt the presence of loved ones about him in the darkness as he wandered up and down the lonely strand. He gazed and listened, and even fancied he caught occasional glimpses of a faint light. "I am not mistaken," he said to himself. "I saw a ship's light, one of the lights on the Duncan. Oh, why can't I see in the dark?" All at once the thought rushed across him that Paganel said he was a nyctalope and could see at night. He must go and wake him. The learned geographer was sleeping as sound as a mole. A strong arm pulled him up out of the sand and made him call out. "Who goes there?" "It is I, Paganel." "Who?" "Glenarvan, come, I need your eyes." "My eyes," replied Paganel, rubbing them vigorously. "Yes, I need your eyes to make out the Duncan in this darkness, so come." "Confound the nyctalopia," said Paganel, inwardly, though delighted to be of any service to his friend. He got up and shook his stiffened limbs, and stretching and yawning as most people do when roused from sleep, followed Glenarvan to the beach. Glenarvan begged him to examine the distant horizon across the sea, which he did most conscientiously for some minutes. "Well, do you see nothing?" asked Glenarvan. "Not a thing, even a cat couldn't see 2 steps before her." "Look for a red light or a green one, her larboard or starboard light." "I see neither a red nor a green light, all is pitch dark," replied Paganel, his eyes involuntarily beginning to close. For half an hour he followed his impatient friend, mechanically letting his head frequently drop on his chest and raising it again with a start. At last he neither answered nor spoke, and he reeled about like a drunken man. Glenarvan looked at him and found he was sound asleep. Without attempting to wake him, he took his arm, led him back to his hole, and buried him again comfortably. At dawn next morning, all the slumberers started to their feet and rushed to the shore, shouting, "Hurrah, hurrah!" as Lord Glenarvan's loud cry, the Duncan," broke upon his ear. There she was, 5 miles out, her courses carefully reefed, and her steam half up. Her smoke was lost in the morning mist. The sea was so violent that a vessel of her tonnage could not have ventured safely nearer the sandbanks. Glenarvan, by the aid of Paganel's telescope, closely observed the movements of the yacht. It was evident that John Mangles had not perceived his passengers, for he continued his course as before. But at this very moment, Thalcave fired his carbine in the direction of the yacht. They listened and looked, but no signal of recognition was returned. A second and a third time the Indian fired, awakening the echoes among the sandhills. At last, a white smoke was seen issuing from the side of the yacht. "They see us," exclaimed Glenarvan. "That's the cannon of the Duncan." A few seconds, and the heavy boom of the cannon came across the water and died away on the shore. The sails were instantly altered, and the steam got up, so as to get as near the coast as possible. Presently, through the glass, they saw a boat lowered. "Lady Helena will not be able to come," said Tom Austin. "It is too rough." "Nor John Mangles," added McNabbs. "He cannot leave the ship." My sister," cried Robert, stretching out his arms toward the yacht, which was now rolling violently. "Oh, how I wish I could get on board," said Glenarvan. "Patience, Edward, you will be there in a couple of hours," replied the Major. 2 hours, but it was impossible for a boat, a six-oared one, to come and go in a shorter space of time.